evening, everyone. I'm Andrea Grover. I'm the Executive Director of Guildhall. Welcome. I am thrilled that we are working for our second year in a row with the Bridgehampton Childcare and Recreation Center. It's an incredible partnership that we hope to continue every year. Last year they brought Misty Copeland here, and she talked about her life and entering into the dance world and the challenges that she encountered. And it was a beautiful, meaningful program. And I think tonight will be also. I wanted to mention that after the talk by Khalil Gibran Muhammad, we will have a concert at 8:30 by a wonderful man named Samite Mulando, who is from Uganda originally. He became a refugee. And he, through storytelling and playing of various instruments, tells his own story and how he founded a nonprofit called Musicians for World Harmony, which promotes music as a great peacemaker and unifier, especially for displaced people and people who are living in distressed conditions. It's going to be a beautiful, life-changing concert. It kind of helps you get out of your own head and reset your priorities to think about the trajectory of this man and all that he's accomplished. So when you leave, we have a little flyer outside that is for $20 off tickets tonight to that program. Or you can just go to the box office and give the code word INSPIRED. So I'm going to turn it over to Bonnie Cannon, the Executive Director of the Bridgehampton Childcare and Recreation Center. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. How's everybody doing today? Wonderful. Welcome. My name is Bonnie Cannon, and I'm the Executive Director for the Bridgehampton Childcare and Recreational Center, and I welcome you here. I see so many wonderful faces in the audience, and so happy that you took your time to come today. We're here. This is something that we do at the Bridgehampton Childcare and Recreational Center because we are a diverse community. If you don't know anything about us, we've been around since about 1954. I see one of our founders and people in the audience, Mr. Bob North is in the audience, and we've been here for a long time. We have several programs where we do after-school program. We do a teen program. We have a food pantry. We have a college prep program. We have so many things that's going on during the summertime. And then we have these talks like this because we service a diverse community. And what we found is that if individuals get to know each other better and we talk about some of the tough issues, that'll make it better, not only for us, but also for the entire community. So this is why we have these types of talks here today. And I'm not going to belabor the moment. I would say that if you haven't been to the center, please just don't drive by, stop by, get to know us. And without further ado, we have some wonderful speakers here today, a speaker here today. And I'm going to introduce and present to some Ken Miller, who is going to be our moderator, and Khalil Muhammad Gibran, that's going to be our speaker for today. Thank you so much.
A boy's born in hard-time Mississippi, surrounded by four walls that ain't so pretty. His parents give him love and affection to keep him strong.
Well, thank you, Bonnie, for the introduction, and thanks to the Bridgehampton Childcare and Recreation Center and all that you do for our community. Thanks to you and Paul Jeffers, PJ, your chairman. I'd like to say it's great to see all you friendly faces out there in the audience, but we can't see you. So Khalil, the topic that you and I are going to talk about today, it might be perennial, but it is certainly timely. In today's New York Times, we had a column by David Brooks, who normally tries to find some positive middle ground, he was going to write a positive column about all the racial progress that's been made in America. He kind of threw in the towel in a column called The Quiet Death of Racial Progress. I thought, for lack of imagination, we might proceed chronologically. And, you know, I have a lot of friends who talk about black people in America in the same breath as immigration. Theory of the case maybe is slavery as a U.S. institution was only 89 years. But it goes back much further than 1776, and aspects of it continue well beyond the end of the Civil War. So let me take you back to slavery in the colonies and the slave trade. What do you have to say about that?
I think maybe we'll finish before the start of the fall semester. Ken, thanks for having me. I want to say to Bridgehampton community, to Director Bonnie, to the Guildhall hosts, thank you so much for putting this together. I recognize, as you and I have had an ongoing conversation about race and racism in America, that it's not just a perennial and timely conversation, but it's a very difficult one. It'd be nice to have a perennial and timely conversation that were pleasant, that wouldn't bring us to a sense of existential crisis, as I think is the case for many of us here. And you know, these are always historically rooted stories, but they're also very local ones too. And I think part of our goal here tonight is to try to figure out how to make sense of this place, which I am a total stranger to, in light of a national climate, in light of these deeply entrenched problems. So I think one way to think about the slavery story that might be relevant to a local audience is that wealth in this nation is inescapably linked to slavery. And of course, that institution lasts for 250 years. And that we're beginning to learn more and more a term that scholars use called racial capitalism. And the term is not in vogue in the kinds of conversations that you've had with people who think 89 years not too bad. But the term is meant to collapse the distinction between slavery as something that happened a long time ago, of which, of course, no one bears any responsibility for, precisely because it happened a long time ago, and something that is actually aberrational. Now, I'm saying this to an audience of folks who know that's nonsense, but I can tell you, as a person who teaches graduate students at the Kennedy School, a place that is not about history and humanities, but is about applied economics and decision-making and behavioral sciences, they are not only being currently taught that slavery was aberrational, but haven't been taught up until that point. And I say that not to embarrass them, but to say that if we can't get the story of the fundamental economic engine of this nation right, with all of the horrors that come with it, then it's hard not to imagine a day when we'll be having a perennial, timely conversation about something much more pleasant.
I should have said that we'll have this conversation between us for maybe an hour,
Yep.
and then we'll take questions from the audience. And the general game plan I have in mind is we'll talk about the big picture, we'll work our way up to the present, and then we'll talk about a little bit about the Hamptons and what's going on around here. But did you call it racial capitalism?
That's right.
At the time of the Civil War, I think black people were worth as tradable objects, something like the entire U.S. GDP at that time. But could you say a little more about what you mean about when you talk about racial capitalism?
Sure. So Ken just gave one example of quantifying the actual real asset of enslaved people. So there are roughly 4 million people who are enslaved at 1860. And those dollars, they were worth about $4 billion. And $4 billion represented something like 48 times the expenditure of the federal government, something like 7 times the value of all financial institutions in the United States, and 3 times the railroads. So if you just take that set of valuations of the real property of which those human beings represented to the nation's economy, you can't imagine American wealth from 1860 going forward without that head start. But that's just the beginning. We've known that fairly long time. What we've learned more recently is that with all of that wealth, as all of you can imagine, well, you can use that wealth to gain more wealth. So you collateralize that wealth. You use it as security to get additional wealth. So some of the earliest financial instruments that we take for granted today with capitalism come as a result of the use of human property to secure debt so as to invest in other ventures. That's a big deal because that now moves us out of this horrible class of terrible people who were plantation slave owners that we all want to, put in the annals of the worst people in the world to distinguish ourselves from them, and moves us squarely to Wall Street.
Well, I don't want to put you on the spot by asking you how many of our first 12 presidents had slaves.
All but 2.
All but 2, right?
All but 2, yeah. So that also has a kind of problem, too, in the way that we think about it, because then it feels like, well, hell, everybody was doing it. And so, what we tend to think about is maybe our moral compass is not a fair guide to how people thought about slavery in that time period. And while it is certainly true that our sensibilities today are different, it is not true that there wasn't a moral compass that saw slavery as an abomination against God.
But taking you then back to before the founding of the United States, somehow by the time of the Civil War, slavery had become endemic to the economy of the South, King Cotton. But back to the initial slave trade, how did we get from the colonies to King Cotton? What happened there?
Well, okay, so a couple of myth busters. So while it is certainly true that with Eli Whitney's cotton gin and that technology increased the potential for cotton to become the leading export of which it did become in the world, so most of us are wearing something with cotton in it. Well, if we go back 200 years, it was the United States that provided the cotton that clothed most of the rest of the world. But that cotton was not turned into clothing in the South. That cotton left the South and moved to mills that could be found on both sides of the Atlantic. In the North, in New England, here we are, as well as in London. Not only did that cotton become clothing in New England and in London, it is also true that the boats that moved those people from Africa and the cotton back to England were built in New England as well. In which case, the wealth of New England itself, tied both to shipbuilding and after whaling to textile mills, is fundamentally linked to slavery. There's no escaping it. Which means that although it is true that a place like New England carried a tradition of abolitionism quite distinct from the South, where none could be found, it is also true that they were crazy people in the 19th century. Crazy in the way that people like to think of, say, a Colin Kaepernick as a lunatic for disrespecting the flag, or a crazy person in the way that John Brown led a raid on a federal arsenal, because that's what crazy people do in order to change systems.
Well, what do you have to say about the Civil War itself and its romanticization by certain elements?
Well, that it's alive and well. To quote Brian Stevenson, the great death penalty indigent defense lawyer in Montgomery, Alabama, who directs the Equal Justice Initiative, he says that we won the Civil War but lost the racial narrative battle, which is to say that we're still fighting over how to make sense of the fact that upwards of 750,000 people died in the United States on either side of the Mason-Dixon line, fighting about something. In today's world of political spend and historical illiteracy, it was not, of course, about slavery. It was about federalism. It was about states' rights. That's not true, of course. But the extent to which we're even having a debate that demonstrates what children are exposed to both in their homes, classrooms, and churches about what the Confederate flag symbolizes as a form of Southern heritage, not a form of treason against the United States in defense of an institution that was a moral abomination. So it's hard not to talk about the Civil War today without recognizing that the legacy of the Civil War is very much a part of our national political culture.
Well, it occurs to me to ask you about black people who fought in the Civil War, because in many of our, certainly after World War II, not to get too close to the present yet, black people served for the United States of America and came back to a very prejudiced country. They found that the veterans' benefits weren't available to them, and they were very underappreciated. What about the black soldiers in the Civil War?
Yeah, it's an interesting contemporary resonance with that. So first of all, something like 200,000 African Americans fought in the actual Civil War. Untold numbers of women served both in official capacity as nurses, as other forms of enlisted and voluntary supporters of men on the battlefield. But essentially, the war itself is partly a consequence of the choices that African Americans made to support abolitionism, which was both a black and white affair for those who were free and mostly Northern, to support the cause of abolition. In other words, some of the earliest rumblings of the potential for war were black people leaving. So we know about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, in part because they were forcing the North to come to terms with the inevitability, or at least the potential of black people to change the course of the nation. That's a missing footnote, because while we talk to some degree, Frederick Douglass, for example, the most famous black abolitionist, had two sons, both of whom served in the 54th Massachusetts Regiment in the war itself. That story's been told, and certainly if you've seen Glory, you've seen some version of this. But what has not been told as well is the degree to which African Americans pressed the hand of the Union by pursuing freedom before the war itself.
I'm kind of stunned to learn that you believe that was such a factor.
Yeah, of course, right? Like, how could black people have agency?
Well,
yeah.
Okay, but I never heard the story before. You feel, based on what, that they were that much of a factor?
Well, the fact of the matter is, every sign of resistance was a sign of hope and optimism for the potential for change and transformation. So by the 1850s, and certainly right up until the election of Abraham Lincoln, it's clear that African Americans are prepared to revolt. Now, it's not en masse, so we're still talking about 200,000 who serve out of 4 million. But there was an established black political leadership, small in number, who were the same people who became Reconstruction leaders, 14 in Congress, 2 who became senators, something like 1,500 elected officials across various offices in the South. Those people didn't have a political awakening at the first sound of the Civil War. Those people were planning their political retribution and their seat at the table before the war happened. So when you think about networks, we only think about networks through the lens of an underground railroad, of freedom, of people leaving the South. But no, in fact, people were preparing to force the hand of allies, mostly in the North, to prepare for what would eventually become the Civil War. So it's a subtle distinction in that they had political ambitions to change their fortunes. That it would result in the war itself that it became was nobody's certainty.
Well, frankly, that's a revelation to me. As to the war, as to the Civil War, there's a quote that I'd like to actually read by Walter Russell Mead from the April Foreign Affairs magazine. He says, he describes inefficient politicians, frequent scandals, racial backsliding, polarized and irresponsible news media, populists spouting quack economic remedies, growing suspicion of elites and experts, frightening outbreaks of violence, major job losses, high-profile terrorist attacks, anti-immigration agitation, declining social mobility, giant corporations dominating the economy, rising inequality, and the appearance of a new class of super-empowered billionaires in finance and technology-heavy industries. You think he's talking about today, but no, he's talking about the immediate post-Civil War period. What did that war accomplish, and what happened in the period of Reconstruction?
We're taking our time moving through.
We're going to get to the present.
No, I mean, these are important historical moments because we think we know them, and we just don't as well. And Reconstruction is certainly one of the most misunderstood periods in American history. For all that we're still fighting about the meaning of the Civil War, we've essentially skipped over the Reconstruction period as a massive failure of the expansion of democracy. Now, for something like 70 years after the period of Reconstruction, from say 1865 to about 1935, the Reconstruction period was understood to be a moment for the absolute failure of the North to essentially put the South under the heel of an uneducated class of corrupt black leadership, the same people that I, in one statement, celebrated for their agency and resistance. Indeed, every American child was taught well into the 1950s, 60s, and probably to some degree up to the present, that Reconstruction was the very thing that animated the movement to protect local control and states' rights, precisely because the federal government did indeed occupy the South. And they occupied the South under the basis in terms of needing to pass 3 amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The first, which was to end slavery. The second was voting rights, and the third, second was equal protection under the law, civil rights, 14th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment was voting rights. So those laws required each state to agree to those amendments in order to be readmitted. Mississippi, I believe, was the last state to accept those terms. And it required actual force of arms to protect the newly gained citizenship rights of African Americans. Now, I won't belabor the point much more, but the whole thing ends not because of corruption or lack of fitness for office for African Americans. Indeed, one of their legacies of the Reconstruction period was 3,000 churches and schools built during this time period, and essentially establishing for the first time a publicly funded school system across all of the Confederate states, because they recognized the commitment to literacy in ways that most Southerners, particularly working class and middle income Southern whites, did not. By 1877, there's an election that looks a lot like Gore v. Bush. Before it goes to the Supreme Court, a backdoor deal is made where Rutherford B. Hayes, governor of Ohio, becomes the president, and you've all heard this story, all of you are educated. So that's the official end of Reconstruction. But what does it do? Well, it opens up finally this rapprochement for the North and the South, of course the South winning, kicking and scheming, for a national economy. And that national economy, with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, does what? It literally makes possible the great age of technology and industrialization. The second industrial revolution is born, the great era of robber barons. And so that quote comes in response to the tremendous wealth inequality, where essentially the national economy is running roughshod over not only indigenous people's lands, but every other farmer in America, black or white, whose property was in the way of a major magnate, whether it was a railroad tycoon from Vanderbilt or whether it was Rockefeller with his plans for fossil fuel extraction, you name it. And that produces the period of a populist uprising that gave the possibility for interracial alliance between black and white Southerners, farmers, I should say, it's not just a Southern thing, who in the end are not able to rally together against corporate interest, in part because of racial scapegoating. And we talk a lot about populism because this is an era where populism emerges as an economic critique of that robber baron inequality, which is resolved not by interracial alliances, is resolved by racial terror. Lynching emerges as a consequence of that, and the outmigration of African Americans. And what do whites get in exchange for this? They get the security of their whiteness. So the great era of white supremacy emerges in this moment as a robust intellectual defense of white people's natural superiority over black people.
Okay, so now we're getting to the music that we came into, Stevie Wonder's Living for the City. There was this northern migration. It's the period that your very well-regarded book, Condemnation of Blackness, deals with. It's the period that Sherilyn Eiffel's book, On the Courthouse Lawn, deals with, where there were these constant in terrorem lynchings that took place as a kind of didactic show of force to both the white and black community. And I wonder if you'd say a word about the thesis of your book and what happened in the kind of reinvention of racism that took place to deal with this migration.
Yeah. So, a great segue. So, it's counterintuitive to most people when they think about white supremacy as a kind of unchanging saying. Like, of course, in slavery times, white people assumed they were more powerful and more gifted, despite the fact that most whites did not own slaves. Nevertheless, the kind of abject reality of white over black sent the message that white people were at least superior in arms, if nothing else. But there had not been, until the late 18th century, and most certainly with much greater attention at the end of the Civil War and following the Reconstruction period, a national commitment to the science of racism in ways that proved with intellectual rigor at the most prestigious universities, including Harvard, in the country, the point that white people were indeed, by IQ, by brain size, by every measurable form, memory retention, you name it, they tested it. And this is the period for the heyday of racial science. Now, the good news is that scientists tended, most of them, not all, tended to follow their own protocols. And so when it turned out that they could not correlate brain size with IQ, they threw out the brain size argument. It took them a while, but eventually they did. And so what happened is the physical scientists could never quite find the smoking gun over the course of really something like 100 years. But in earnest, from about the 1850s to the turn of the 20th century, they could never find the smoking gun that could correlate perfectly some form of physicality with some form of evidence of superiority. I've used brain size because that was the most common one, but they tried hair texture. They tried. The point is they could find genius across the entire spectrum of humanity. And as long as they could, they said, well, yeah, I guess we can't prove this point. The behavioral sciences, however, stepped in and filled the void. And the behavioral sciences, beginning in about the 1890s, began to look at big data. So one of the things that I'm struck by in our moment is that we think big data is going to save us from racial bias. We think by training algorithms to be really smart, we're going to remove bias from human beings and fix it with computers. But of course, as any person knows, garbage in, garbage out, right? So your algorithms are only as good as what you code them to be. And as such, we still live in a society with institutional racism and certainly historical racial data or racist data. So one of the most long-standing and enduring justifications for white supremacy, it turns out, could be found in the big data of the US Census that showed one generation after the end of slavery that African Americans made up roughly a third of the prisoners in the United States of America, when they were only about 12% of the overall population. Now, in a world with Giuliani representing the great age of law and order in the Trump administration, it doesn't take much to see why statistics like that would have such legs, because it proved the point, like, oh, now that they're free, these people are a race of criminals. And that association between crime statistics that could be measured first, every 10 years in the census, but eventually annually through something like the Uniform Crime Reports, which are authoritative to this day, they study local arrest data, became the most important and significant argument for the inherent threat that black people posed as free people. Education remained, in some places first, I would argue second, because it's constantly been subject to far more critique and a far more robust response from within the social scientific community that, what we know today to be achievement gaps or differences in test scores is not a rough racial index of white over black, but in fact tied to the socioeconomic context in which people are educated and live.
So criminality was conflated with blackness for black people, but for white people, it was just deprivation. It was made into a class thing. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it was an opioid crisis.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I wasn't going to get to this till later, but I want to ask you to talk a little about stereotypes, how black people are stereotyped. We've heard so many, whites and blacks have heard so many stories about things that are essential to blacks and blacknesses. I have the sense that from reading James Baldwin and other writers, that some of that is internalized in black people and in the black community. Baldwin said at a certain point, at one point I thought God was white. What do you have to say about these internalized prejudices? How are they used?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Baldwin, because he was certainly one of the most expressive in terms of his own story, his own journey, and wrote a lot about it in both essay and novel form, but was a keen observer of the efficacy with which the project and the work of white supremacy had been incredibly effective. It not only fooled white people into believing their own superiority, but it also fooled black people into believing their inferiority. Dr. King said in Why We Can't Wait, which was a book he published right at the end of the March on Washington, before the Civil Rights Bill was passed at the top of 1964. And I say this because it's a big part of how I think about this work and the question you asked. He said that the textbooks in this country had completely ignored the contributions of the Negro. And in that erasure of black people's own role and part in the American experiment, it had created an anachronistic doctrine of white superiority and a sense of inferiority or Negro worthlessness, he described. He also referred to the same phenomenon later on as cultural homicide. And the reason I emphasize that point because Dr. King used active voice. It wasn't that we had this problem in the way that we think about implicit bias or unconscious bias today, this very passive construct. Like, oh, our brains are wired this way to see, this person is dangerous and this person is safe. No, in fact, we have absorbed information that was deliberately and intentionally scripted to teach our brains to think this way. Just like we teach girls, we socialize girls to be feminine, and we socialize boys to be masculine. They don't just come out of the womb expecting to behave a certain way. And so as a consequence of that, Dr. King's active argument there that the textbook writers had created this construct by erasure, or as those who believe that the Confederacy is about Southern heritage and not hate, means that these stereotypes are actively being taught to us right now as we speak and live. They're not just things that sit in the ether and we just somehow can't get around them, which is why it's so important that we actually change the way that we teach our history, we change the way we talk about the past, that we make a commitment to be brave. And I say this, frankly, for white people, more so for black people, because white people still control the machinery of learning and education and power in this country. So, it's kind of like something I teach in another context. There's this wonderful critique of colorblindness. And the poster that they use is sort of a very dark-skinned black boy's face and a very pale white boy's face, and they're sort of cheek to cheek. And the sign says, I don't teach race, we're all colorblind. But colorblindness itself leaves intact the actual universe of intentional white supremacist ideas that we still have. So in other words, if you don't teach race and racism, if you think by not talking about it with your children, by leaving them innocent and pure, they will absorb the actual world that we live in, which is thoroughly colored.
Well, and staying on that point, I'm told that in Germany, there's no educated person who doesn't know the history of the Holocaust. It's taught. It's required learning. When we end this portion of the program, I'm going to come back and ask you what you think can be done. But since you mentioned Dr. King, let's jump forward to the civil rights movement a bit. In today's paper, we had the news that the federal government is reopening the investigation of the Emmett Till case. Actually, the backstory for tonight's event was a discussion that we had at the Bridgehampton Childcare and Recreation Center on this topic. And I was conducting it with the thought that I would smoke out the difference between the way whites and blacks saw the controversy about the showing of a contemporary artist named Dana Schutz at the Whitney Biennial. Certain black artists had said, this is cultural appropriation, it shouldn't be done. And a number of the whites in the audience felt that that was censorship. And anyway, there was quite a divide on the topic. But comes Emmett Till, the horrendous death. Several months later, in 1955, was Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott. 1960 were the Woolworth sit-ins. And then 64 was Freedom Summer. I got to the South a year later, right after the murder of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodwin, and quickly felt that I was experiencing the last days of the black and white together, period, of the civil rights movement. How do you see the civil rights movement, and what do you think it accomplished?
It's another one of these big questions, right? So if I were fortunate enough to be on All Things Considered, I'd have to give you a 2-minute response. I would say that the civil rights movement was necessary but insufficient. We can't skip over these chapters. And so there's a couple of things that are really stick out now 50 years later. One, we realize now that white ambivalence may have been much more of a problem than white resistance than we gave attention to in the time period. And why do I say that? It's because most of the mythologization of the civil rights movement is about the nation's capacity to get it right. You heard this time and time again during the Obama presidency. This nation is always moving forward towards a more perfect union. And so in that, it sort of endows everyone with the good news of the hard work and sacrifice of those foot soldiers, right, who were on the front lines. And so the cloak of this mythologization is that, like, everybody was on board, because at some point, there's no resistance except for small pockets, kind of like the small pockets of white nationalists, right, that we want to keep thinking are far fewer in number and influence than they actually are. And I think when Dr. King says in Where Do We Go From Here in 1967, like he said in the letter from Birmingham jail about white moderates, he says fundamentally that the problem in 1967 was the unwillingness of most whites. He called it that they were, and I'm using his words, that they had psychological cataracts, that they used bland euphemisms, that they lived in a fantasy of self-deception. All Dr. King's words. Because what he recognized is that the civil rights movement had not touched the hearts and minds or the swimming pools or the neighborhoods of the vast majority of white people. No protest ever showed up in their neighborhoods. No black kid ever showed up in their schools. It wasn't their problem. And although they could watch it on television, and although the nation made fundamental changes that could potentially impact them, they lost very little until a black kid did show up in their neighborhood. And so as a consequence, Dr. King's frustration wasn't just what we have heard so much about, the problems of money and military, the war in Vietnam and poverty, that it was in fact that white people were not committed to anti-racism. And that unless they were willing to deal with what he called, his own words, the cancer of racism in America, the body politic would never heal. And then, of course, he's assassinated within a year. So for me, looking back over those 50-year period, if I could prescribe to every person in the audience to read Where Do We Go From Here, not because it has all of the answers for what ails us in 2018, but because it accurately diagnoses one of the major pillars of the problem that we face today, which is the unwillingness of most whites to take ownership of the problem of systemic racism in American society. That it's not just about intimacy and proximity to a person of color. It's not just about your handful of black friends if you happen to have a handful. It's not just about what's in your heart. It's not just about how you've raised your child to be a good person. Systemic racism has itself evolved to be far more pernicious and insidious. For a simple example, mass incarceration isn't just a consequence of a set of policy choices over time. It is also the logic that someone like Michael Bloomberg argued over 3 terms of mayor, that it is perfectly legitimate to make assumptions about 15-year-old black boys if for no other reason that they live in a particular neighborhood. If that isn't racism, if that isn't racial discrimination, but of course he never called it as such, and as long as you convince a person who is unwilling to accept the basic framework of this problem of institutional racism, then of course policing can't be racist.
So while we're on the subject, why don't you say a word about government-sponsored racism in housing, in the law?
Absolutely. So simple point. I think a lot of people by now know this, but 10 years ago, most people did not, because the research had not been as compelling or as widely read. And that is that beginning roughly in the 1930s, when the New Deal establishes the basic infrastructure of home buying in this country today, first by extending credit to home builders so that more homes would come online in the wake of the Great Depression, and second, by encouraging longer lending periods for the average home buyer that would go from, say, 5 years to 30 years, which would make the payment drop to next to nothing for most people, we had a huge explosion of home ownership. And who was left out of that? Black people. Redlining was itself a consequence of creating, first in the private sector, then in the public sector. We began with private real estate agreements, which were restrictive covenants, private behavior by banks and not choosing to lend to communities that were too black or in transition. And the federal government bought it hook, line, and sinker because they were trying to work with the existing players, kind of like all those financial players who were responsible for the great housing meltdown in 2008, who all got nothing in terms of prosecutions. So you're playing with the same people who, before 1935 and the New Deal, control the real estate industry, become the advisors and lobbyists to one afterwards. And essentially, black people get left out. They also get left out for roughly 25 years from Social Security because the Southerners lobbied against two occupational categories of workers whose benefits were inextricably tied to the nation's treasury, left out domestic workers and farm workers. Why? Because that covered 75% of the black laboring class. So it wasn't until 1955. So think about this. You have your first fired, last hired, first fired, even in the context of the New Deal, which only lasts a certain amount of time. The legacy of those New Deal programs, however, lasts forever. Social Security, so black people don't get the benefits of Social Security for at least a generation. And then secondly, they basically never get the benefits of home ownership, which, as we all know, becomes the most important single asset that the vast majority of Americans have today.
And I think it's probably true that black people in America today have a net worth of roughly the same proportion of the country's net worth as they had at the time of the Civil War.
Let's make it even more plain. It's, and this number moves depending on which you're using, but something like $5,000 is the average net worth of an African American compared to $110,000 is the average net worth for a white person. So,
which is very significant. But let's
put it mildly.
Yeah. Well, before we turn to race in the Hamptons,
can I just say one more thing about that wealth
absolutely
gap? So, you know, again, if we were on Fox News and Sean Hannity was, you know, moderating this conversation between us, or we were on a panel, the response, or, you know, the sexual predator Bill O'Reilly, the response would be, well, black people have made bad choices with how they spend their money.
Yeah.
Their profligacy is the root of their wealth gap, or because they come from broken homes and don't study hard enough. And if we don't name that, that's what sits underneath these disparities that we name. We're really good about talking about the disparities. The harder part for us is to actually explain the racism inherent in the disparities. Because if we just leave the disparity intact, people walk away filling in the blanks. And they walk away, in some ways, reinforced in their point of view that there must be something wrong with black people if there's so many in prison and they have so little in their bank accounts.
Well said. Look, you and I both grew up on the south side of Chicago. I was a teenager. I got a job with
I feel like this is the beginning of The Jerk with Steve Martin.
No, but it is a sneak attack because I'm going to mention the fact that I used to deliver mail to your great-grandfather, Elijah Muhammad. And you were not to be born for several years after that. But And your father was a very distinguished Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer.
He's still distinguished.
Okay.
That hasn't changed.
Still. But would you say a word about the many attempts by black people to get organized and do something about the problem? I don't as much, I'm not as interested in Marcus Garvey as I am about how you see the black Muslims.
Yeah, it's a both and, because in some ways, the strength of the Nation of Islam by the 1940s and 50s is a legacy of Marcus Garvey's movement. Marcus Garvey, for those who don't know, is a Jamaican immigrant to the United States and has these crazy dreams of building a shipping line that will be for blacks and by blacks to participate in international trade. And he wants to use it as the economic basis for colonizing Africa on terms that would essentially mirror capitalism. In other words, he wanted to get in on the game. And he organized something called the United Negro Improvement Association, which was a dues-paying membership organization. And the idea was not only were you part of this organization, which was going to essentially create a form of black-empowered capitalism beginning in the 1910s, that it would itself become the basis for a new nationhood that Europeans would respect, because black people would then have a basis for power and making claims for better political treatment here and abroad. It was the first mass movement of working class black people. First, we thought it was just in places like New York City, which was home to the UNIA. We found out more recently that it was all over the place. And indeed, one direct link between Marcus Garvey's organizing and the success of the UNIA was Malcolm X's father was a member of the UNIA in Oklahoma, Michigan. Where was Malcolm X early on? I'm drawing blanks here. Michigan, yeah. So, no, but there's an Oklahoma part, and then Michigan. Yes, I know I'm not crazy. So if you think about that connection between Malcolm X, who becomes a protege of Elijah Muhammad, and the most successful, prominent national minister who brings into the fold of the nation more members than anybody then or since, that tie is not to be missed. And the basis for the Nation of Islam's own notion of economic empowerment also took basically a black capitalist approach, which is that black people are going to own, as best they can, the means of production. They bought land in Georgia to build farms. They had factories on the south side of Chicago. They had a whole chain of banks and real estate, banks and retail establishments, from dry cleaners to bakeries, et cetera, and got into the wholesale market as well, for the purposes of saying, we're going to put our own people to work to protect them from the vagaries. Because one of the things that made it very difficult for black people to organize resistance to white supremacy was the threat of losing your job. It wasn't just the threat of losing your life, as was certainly true in the South, but in places where the Nation of Islam was very active, first in Detroit, then in Chicago, spread to Philadelphia, New York, et cetera, it was about your job. And if you couldn't stand up to the kind of very tricky racism, the kind of de facto racism of the North, which was often enforced by policing and building codes, for example, and the kind of attitudes that teachers brought to the classroom, then you had a much harder time. And that legacy ultimately was a major threat to the nation, to the United States of America, precisely because it wasn't just a quiet, we're going to marshal and build our own resources. It was a robust critique of racism as well. So it was a both and. It was about the money, and it was about the critique of systemic institutional racism.
Well, I'm dying to get to race in the Hamptons, but I got to say one more thing about this. Before I became a community organizer, I formed a fund to invest in black businesses. It was part of the black capitalism thing. And then I read in Richard Rothstein's book how black capitalism was used by the Nixon administration basically as an excuse for government inaction. And the black banks were a disappointment, and it never really happened. In fact, the first black graduates of the Harvard Business School. When I was forming that fund, there were very few of them. They tended to go crazy. They did not have a very good experience in white America. What have you to say about black capitalism today? I mean, black people have had tremendous successes in media and in sports. We've had some, exemplary successes among black capitalists. What have you to say about, I mean, part of the overarching problem we're talking about, if you want to get meta about it, is capitalism itself.
Well, we started there, right?
But maybe you can say a word about black capitalism.
Sure. So, first of all, there's a great work. I'm forgetting her last name. It's called The Color of Money. You have it in your notes, so please tell them.
Michelle Alexander.
No, that's the new Jim Crow. That's like,
Richard
if you don't know
Rothstein.
the answer. No,
Richard Rothstein.
you'll
The Color of Money, Richard Rothstein.
It's not. That's The Color of Law.
Color of Law, you're right. Hold on. Hold on.
We'll get it to you. I'll talk and you find that answer.
All right.
Okay. So, one simple way to think about this is, I just ended one critique of black capitalism, or I should say one summary of black capitalism vis-a-vis black nationalism going back to the 1910s, with black people pooling their resources to have greater protections over their own livelihoods. And that extends through the Nation of Islam, well into the even to this day, but the Nation of Islam is a shadow of its former self in terms of its economic prowess in black communities. The problem, or the difference between that black capitalism and the black capitalism that comes vis-a-vis Nixon, which was an absolute public policy. It wasn't just something that just happened. It was a way of saying, we're going to put through the Small Business Administration money into the black community. We're going to promote affirmative action, which was a Nixon policy choice, for the purposes of creating a class of middle-class black professionals who will become bulwarks of capitalism.
Mesbics, they were called.
Okay.
But I can't find the name of that author. I'm too interested in what you're saying to look it up.
So in Nixon's imagination, these people would put a lie to the radical critique of the leftists, the Black Panther Party that was very much socialist in its economic outlook, and much of the left, of the black left in particular, had incredibly robust homegrown and international critiques of capitalism. The war and scramble for post-colonial Africa was a war and scramble of whether these would be capitalist nations in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, or communist or socialist ones. Latin America, the same story. So what happens under Richard Nixon and what happens with this new class of black capitalists is they drop the critique of racism. They literally join the table of domination, and that's a wrap. Now, that may sound uncomfortable in the Hamptons with, perhaps in the room or the legacy of such, but in part, that's one of the lessons of the civil rights era, is that it was not enough to open the door professionally to black people to come into corporations at token levels. Ellis Coast wrote 20 years ago of the rage of the black middle class in terms of the tokenization of those firsts who came into those institutions. That some of those firsts, or the children of those firsts, became millionaires, very few billionaires, of course, but became millionaires, some multimillionaires who are very successful in what they did. This is not a critique of their personhood or their morality. It is a critique of the policy choice that meant that that person's millions was never going to translate into a set of policy choices that would have dealt with mass incarceration, would have dealt with the resegregation of American schools, would have dealt with the wealth gap, which was born of federal policies that gave white people a hand out and black people a smack in the face. So empowering a smaller number of black capitalists in the 1970s forward, which meant the possibility of having a black wealthy neighbor in the Hamptons, was not sufficient, never intended to be sufficient, to those people becoming evidence of a fundamental attack on systemic racism in America.
Well, as it turns out, I don't have a black wealthy neighbor because in the Hamptons, it's a little like Ferguson. It's very segregated. In fact, the last time we had this discussion, I don't know if my friend Jeff Jeffries is in the audience, but he used the expression, life behind the hedges. We have a very segregated situation. When we had a Black Lives Matter rally in West Hampton, I think it was a couple summers ago, we were quite concerned that the Ku Klux Klan would show up. Suffolk County is a hugely prejudiced sea that we're in the middle of, and we're a very privileged island in part. I assume we're not alone in that regard. What do you have to say? I know you're not an expert on the Hamptons. I think you should say a few words, and then maybe we should bring the Hamptons into the discussion.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we've established in this conversation, in this, very brisk,
It's getting a little long in the tooth.
45 minutes. No, it's good. We got a good amount of time. I think we've established the larger forces that built an infrastructure that makes possible in 2018 the kinds of racial divides that you're describing here in the Hamptons. So the same financial system that people borrow money to buy a big house behind the hedges is still in place. Mm-hmm. And we've not disrupted that financial system to address, either through reparations or a set of policy choices that would prioritize the least of these, in this case, African Americans or Native people in this country, or those who have long been actively discriminated against. So, I don't have to be in the Hamptons to know that, you buy a house in the Hamptons and, some folks are buying it straight out cash, but that's not a good use of your money. So you're going to borrow a little at low interest rates, and that's the same banking system. There was just a study by investigative journalists at ProPublica that looked at big data on 31 million mortgage data points and found systemic evidence of the same kinds of predatory and discriminatory lending practices just in the last 6 months. So to the degree to which the Hamptons has exacerbated the kind, or I should say, not the Hamptons, that the Hamptons is symptomatic of the kind of aggregate and worsening problem of racialized capitalism or wealth inequality in this country, that makes a lot of sense. The other thing, of course, is that the original black settlers of Long Island more generally were people, and this is contrary to how most people think about the Great Migration. Headline, there were black people who never wanted to move to the city. They actually wanted to move to the country. They just didn't want to live in Alabama, Mississippi, or Georgia. They wanted a farm. They wanted to farm their own land. They wanted to be left alone. They didn't want neighbors. They didn't want to live on top of people. And there's a great book written by a guy named Andrew Wiese, W-I-E-S-E, called A Place of Their Own, A Land of Their Own. I'm trying not to mix it with Stanley Nelson's film about Martha's Vineyard, but Andrew Wiese is his name. And that's partly the story of Long Island more generally, including the Hamptons. Those black migrants came straight here, and they tried to make a go of the same kind of commitment to land ownership and farming that they had known in the South, but under the most extreme conditions. And what did they find? They found racist white people. Sometimes they found allies, but oftentimes they found either a kind of, why are you here? You don't really belong here, or they found outright hostility. They also found an economic system that, as we've already talked about, when those potato fields started to build homes with government-backed mortgages that they couldn't get. Right. So it essentially locked them into a permanent class of low-wage, landless workers. And of course, many heroic black people overcame those odds. We learned the story of Clyde Ross that Ta-Nehisi Coates tells in the great article in The Atlantic, The Case for Reparations. A person like Clyde Ross, who essentially is buying a house on layaway, which is literally outside of the system that most whites have access to, because another kind of predatory class, payday lenders for homes, comes along and says, yeah, I'll make sure you get a home, but you miss one payment and it's mine.
Okay, well, listen, I could ask you questions forever and learn from you. It's been fantastic so far. Let me now turn to the audience. We're going to have to vacate the hall sooner than we'd like. There are microphones in the aisle. If you're going to ask a question, please do identify yourself by name. This is being videoed, so you should assume if you ask a question, it may go viral on the internet. But is there anyone who would care to ask a question at this point? We have someone back there.
Hi, Khalil. E.T. Williams. I live in Sag Harbor, as you may know.
Is your microphone on?
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Thank you.
We summer in Sag Harbor and live in the city. But I wanted to go way back to the first census of free Negroes that was taken in 1830. And could you talk a little bit about the free black community that lived in America in the 17 and early 1800s?
Sure. It's not exactly my bailiwick in terms of rich detail, but essentially there have always been black folks who were free. Going back to the first who came here in 1619. Many of them were treated as indentures because the legal apparatus and the social consequences of this grand experiment of these Africans and these Europeans and the indigenous population that was already here, the details hadn't been worked out. And so that population gave birth to other populations. In other words, there have always been property-owning black people somewhere in the United States on any given day, not in any given place, but certainly around. And so by the time of the establishment of the nation, the gradual abolition laws that take place across the northern states, North didn't have the land for large-scale slavery and plantations, so its future would not be predicated on massive slave ownership. Of course, the African slave trade ends in 1808, which meant that essentially where the land was most accommodating, in this case King Cotton, to slavery is where the enslaved population ended up. And so the North gradually drains itself, first by the choice politically to abolish slavery through gradual abolition laws, and then secondly through an internal slave trade that heats up after the transatlantic one ends, which sends basically the rest of the black population as best they could down to the south. Who's left? The population that is left are people who were most secure, either because they lived in households that were never in the way that we think of slavery. They were basically domestic workers, people who were enslaved but in fact worked essentially as domestics, people who had owners who were basically good people in the way that we would think of them as good people within that context. And so they freed their slaves or the enslaved people when those gradual abolition laws took place, gave them a little property and the money. Who else? Well, the children of rape who were biracial or mulatto, and those folks represented that class. So in New York, in Philadelphia, especially, a place like Charleston, you had visible and demonstrable populations of antebellum blacks before the Civil War who did all sorts of amazing things. They invented things. They helped to direct the political leadership of their communities. They joined the abolitionist cause. They owned land. They transferred wealth from one generation to the next. And to some degree, they did the best that they could for those who made that choice. There were others who kept their heads down, just like you would expect in any population where people don't want to pay the price for changing the fortunes of somebody else. A good example of that is John Lewis talks about growing up on a chicken farm in Troy, Alabama. By 15, he's reading about Dr. Martin Luther King, decides he wants to go to Nashville, Tennessee to join the Civil Rights Movement. His parents tell him, John, that's a bad idea. And why do they tell them it's a bad idea? Because they might lose their farm. So I'm using that example because you could imagine in the antebellum period what it meant for a family to make a choice about even joining the anti-slavery movement or the abolitionist movements.
Do we have any other questions? I mean, I'm full of questions, but I would...
I have a question.
You must be Bonnie Can.
Yes, I am. I wanted you to say something to our young people that are here, especially in the times that we live in today and with the chaos that's going on in the world today, and just basically what words of wisdom would you give to them as they navigate through the way that things are today? You know, at one point in time, and some feel that going to college or getting an education is a good thing, and others say, no, get a skill or trade, and just dealing with the day-to-day things that are going on today. What, if you had anything to say to young people, what would you say to them?
Read a lot of history. That seems insufficient to the question you ask. I like to think of it this way. We're not going to see the fortunes of Black young people and second, third generation Latino youth in this country, or if you have any Pacific Asian in a place like California where you are honorary Black in that context, until you have the confidence and the courage to stand up for yourself, because people are not going to stand up for you. That's the truth. And in fact, the kind of work that is required for young people to actually have a future that is better than the past or what their parents have experienced requires their political participation in changing the system. Because at this rate, according to Thomas Piketty and others, the likelihood of there being enough jobs to capture sufficiently the kind of quality of life that you could expect 30 years ago in this country is diminishing, which means that it would be educational malpractice on my part if I were to try to prescribe to the students and this young people, what we've always heard, which is, study hard, do well in school, go to college. Well, it's not clear that the kids who are already in college have a future in this country. So we need our young people to read enough to understand how our world works, to understand the systems that they live with, to understand how they came to be, so that they can dismantle them and build better ones, and build new ones. And I teach a class literally that's called Plutocracy, Philanthropy, and the Public Good. And the whole point of the class is to point out that, on average, wealthy people spend a lot of money through philanthropy trying to keep the system functioning just as it is. Which means that more and more kids will show up needing something from a wealthy person rather than being able to own something that is their own and to actually have a political voice in the future of this country. So that's the only way we get to a different future than the present that we already have.
But I wish you were with me when I was at the movie the other day and they showed a trailer of some high school kids. It was a perfectly integrated high school. Blacks and whites were hanging out together, having the normal, good time together. It was cringe-inducing, as if there were no history and no problem. What you're talking about is learning the truth, and I think you have some plans for propagating the true history. But how about some more questions? Oh, we've got some. Good.
Oh, me? Hi, I'm Chloe. I'm from Westport, Connecticut. So this kind of goes into what you were just saying about kind of owning your own success, especially for in terms of me as an African-American female. I just went through the college process, and after I got into my dream school.
The college process now?
Yeah, it was killer. But after I got into my dream school, I had a lot of people coming up to me and pretty much using affirmative action as the reason why I got into the school I got into. And after a while, it really started to tear me down. So I was just wondering if you had any advice for me or any other young African American or minority students in the room who kind of got discouraged because of affirmative action or a system that's seen as a reason for Black people or people who are minorities to get ahead in America. So yeah.
Oh, man. Well, it's the same answer. Okay, so I want to answer this quickly by way of anecdote. 2009, Ellis Coast published a sequel to A Raid of the Privileged Class called The End of Anger. And this was a kind of assessment or a take on what it meant to elect the first African American president. And he wanted to see how African Americans were thinking about the future in light of this transformative moment. And the very quick version is the older the respondents were, the less hopeful that this presidency would change everything for the better. The younger, the more optimistic. But across the board, everyone was feeling rosier about the future of race in America. All right, so at the end of this book is an appendix by Harvard Business School alumni. Some people have heard me speak before. I use this all the time. And the appendix is Top 10 Rules of Success. And if you go down 1 through 10, 1 through 9 basically say something like, keep your head down, work really hard, have big dreams, get to know important people, okay? That covers, I think, most of them. Number 10 says, never talk about race or gender if you can avoid it, other than to say race or gender do not matter. Now, how do you explain this? For the most influential, successful, prestigious business school in the country, for its small number of Black alumni who are guaranteed by virtue of the education and the small number of places that people like that end up to be successful. It explains it because they've been protecting themselves from the stigma of having to defend where they belong. So if you just stay in your lane, if you don't present yourself as someone who draws attention to your Blackness or to your womanhood, then people will leave you alone and you will fit in and you will be successful. So we kind of get, you sort of get in what you get out of it. Or you get out of it what you put into it. So my advice to you is, if you want to walk proudly in your Blackness, then you have to do the work of educating people about who you are. And that means you have to respond to that nonsense, because the other side of the ledger of affirmative action has been rolling full steam ahead for 300 years, which meant to be white and male meant you walked into the door with a sense of ownership and entitlement over the fact that people would assume you belong. Now, if you opened your mouth and you sounded like, Jeff Foxworthy, then maybe you don't belong. But the point is that your presentation of self as a white male automatically gives you a right to be there. Now, you can talk yourself out of anything. It has been the opposite. So you have to defend that right, and you cannot be the successful person 10 years from now who gives the same advice that those HBS alumni have been given to other people.
Terrific. We have a person down here.
In about 18 months, my name is William Pickens III. In about 18 months, my family's going to celebrate its 350th year in America, on my mother's side, from Philadelphia. And we've gone through all of the changes in this country. We greeted Thomas Jefferson. We greeted Alexander Hamilton. And then we were thrown into all the chaos that every family like mine has experienced. But we've been here through all of the wars, all of the depressions and recessions, and we're fighting on to this day, right here in Sag Harbor, where we're under the gun of what I call predators who aren't interested necessarily in living among us, but taking things from us. And this is very, very awkward in the Trump era, where racism trumps patriotism. So my family's been here long enough to have taken all the slings and arrows that America can throw at us. We're still fighting. We're still winning sometimes. We're going to continue. I'm almost 82 years old. I told my children I'm going to continue the fight. We have a long, storied history in this country. I'm proud of it. My grandfather was a Yale man, class of 1904, was a member of the Niagara movement, was the youngest member. And he fought and taught me how to fight. He says, don't give up on this country. Don't be bitter about America, make it better. So I'll sit down, but I had to let you know that we've been around. And
I think we have time for one more question.
What's your opinion on how rap lyrics have affected the black community?
It's a mixed story. I disagree with Marcellus in his recent attack on rap. And I have an 18-year-old son here. Gibran, stand up. And my beautiful wife, Stephanie, is here with me, too. So here's the mixed bag. Music is an expression of an artist, and picking on rap music is one of the greatest forms of hypocrisy in terms of seeing the music itself as the reason for mass incarceration or poverty or even violence in the community. It's an easy excuse, because the bottom line is it has been those institutional structures that have diminished the life chances of black people, which have given birth to the expressions that are captured in the music. And if we think this is a chicken and egg debate, it is not a chicken and egg debate. Music has always been an expression of the experiences of the lived reality of people. So we should no more critique and throw out rap music just as a kind of blanket condemnation as we should blues music, which was itself a form of giving voice to the travails and challenges. So, we like the spirituals, but a long time ago, we didn't like the blues. And then we got used to the blues, but we didn't really like the jazz. So maybe we'd learn something from our history. Curtis Mayfield once said, change the conditions, change the music. So that's one response to you. The second is that, and Pedro Nogueira's in the room. Pedro, please hold your hand up. Did he leave? He had to go? Okay. Well, he's a wonderful educator, formerly at NYU, now at UCLA. So anybody in education knows that rap is a form of literacy, and that the capacity to see rap as a form of empowerment in terms of your pedagogy means connecting with children where they are, and then seeing the actual verbal skills of rap, the alliteration, the analogy, the metaphor, all of it are actually the basic building blocks of literacy. So we're missing, yet again, through critiques of black people of being damaged in some way, that all of this is really a series of collective aggregation of terrible choices that black people make, which is why their condition is so bad. That's the oldest running script going back to the beginning of our time here. We deserved it, right? We weren't capable. So the part of the literacy part of it is a really important opportunity that educational researchers, people like Ernest Morrell, who used to be at Teachers College, now he's at the University of Notre Dame. There are lots of people, Sean Harper's at the University of Pennsylvania, keep telling us that rather than looking with some kind of moral contempt at the capacity of young people to understand through rap, we ought to embrace it. and this is not a Ebonics debate, this is a debate about literacy more generally. All children bring a set of literary conventions into the classroom. That one set of literary conventions we imagine as the only standard through which children can learn is one of the major reasons why we don't reach all children in our classroom. So the last part of it, rap music, like any form of culture, can be fuel on a flame, in which case some individuals across every community will be touched by that music in ways that are pathological, antisocial, do more harm than good. But that would be true of just about everything, including television, including drugs. You know, a colleague of mine at Columbia talks about the fact that most people actually use drugs in responsible ways, as in red wine at the end of an evening, and move on and go to work the next day. So the point is that it has been political fodder for a larger narrative of the culture of poverty critique going back over the last 50 years about why it is we have all these disparities in the first place. So do I prefer my son to listen to less explicitly rap music, especially when his boom speaker is outside and the neighbors are listening? Absolutely. Do I think it is doing long-term damage to him? No, because he has as much a right to listen to our artistic expressions of exaggeration, of boast, of the kinds of systemic critiques that rap music embodies as well, because it's not just about sexual conquest, it is also about political critiques. So it's a mixed bag, but ultimately it itself is not the problem.
Khalil, I think this is the time to thank the audience for being here with us on this magical evening. You've been fantastic. Thanks to Guildhall.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.